Which are a bit faster.
Did you receive it? The others?
You've got the email? Okay, good. All right. So you got all the files there. So if I'm talking about a file at a particular point, they'll come down as an embedded file. And if you just see where that little bouncing icon turns up, you just click on it and load that file, and you can run it on your own machine. So that'll be a lot faster. So I got into Goodwin because I read the original Goodwin paper, and he was a great mathematician, apparently a great artist, and a lousy writer. It really was hard to what the hell's going on in this model. He did a very intelligent trick. He wrote the model before there were really computers to help simulate, certainly in terms of personal computers. So he did a diagrammatic way of building a cyclical model, which is quite fascinating. So it is worth reading the original paper for that reason, which is from 1967. So quite worth having a look at. But the best explanation by far came from Blatt. So if you read the book on Blatt, you'll really get a grip on what I've given you a brief overview of here. We'll go through all the mathematics for you quite well. He uses a nonlinear function for the investment function and for workers. No, not for investment function, for workers' wage demands. I use the same basic mathematical form in my 1995 paper, which is written in August of 1992, by the way. It's very important that it was 3 years late before it got published, long story. And in the meantime, the phenomenon that the model anticipated had started to be recognised by economists. I wrote the model before what they call the Great Moderation was even obvious in the data. Anyway, so I'd already read Minsky. Hang on, I read Minsky first? Read Minsky in 1987. And I did the Minsky model in 1992. So but I think I've read Goodwin much at the same time, I'm not really sure. But I'd always seen a role for finance in economics. It would annoyed me that economics mainstream separated finance from economics as if they were two hermetically sealed compartments, which of course they're not. But what fascinated me about reading Minsky the first time that I did read him, which is in 1987, was that I'd read so many critiques of capitalism. I'd read a lot of Marx, I'd read Moran and Sweezy, Schumpeter, not Schumpeter's best work by a long stretch, but quite a few, Keynes, Fisher, and I felt there was just something lacking. None of the models really appealed, because a lot of them would argue that capitalism had a tendency towards stagnation. Now, I didn't see stagnation, I saw exuberance. And Minsky was the first person who made that his starting point of talking about the tendency. He said the fundamental instability in a capitalist economy is upwards. The tendency to turn doing well into a speculative boom is the fundamental weakness of a capitalist economy. That, I thought, nailed it. That's what I saw happening. Booms followed by a bust. And it was an explanation that wasn't all about deviation from equilibrium, which was if you look even at the Austrians who deride equilibrium, they still talk in terms of a natural rate and a deviation from a natural rate. And they had, again, no role for debt, no role for the finance sector in an essential way. It was an embellishment to capitalism. So I really enjoyed Minsky, and I read Goodwin, and what amazed me was the two weren't combined. Now, I might talk out of school here, because as I said, I had I can't say an unpleasant interaction with Minsky, sort of a non-interaction, really, when I met him personally. But I wrote a paper critiquing the Hicks-Harrod-Hansen second-order multiplier accelerator model. That I found a mathematical error, not a mathematical error in it, which meant it was therefore it was an error in logic in deriving it. The model was derived by equating actual savings, badly defined, to intended investment. Now, there's no model of economics that said those two are equal. So the answer was, the only thing it gave you was it was a cycle towards zero employment, zero GDP. Anyway, one of the referees turned the article down because they didn't quote him, and he's lucky because they thought what he wrote was garbage when I finally read it, but it got rejected by the EJ, after which I received this letter from Goodwin, who was actually in favour of it being published. And I talked about Minsky as well, and, pardon me, I'll zoom in here if I can. Can I zoom in? Yeah. So here is Goodwin on Minsky, and have a read, it's quite fascinating. You get a lot of messages on that machine.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
Notice the letter jumps all over the place. But the main points to take out of it, he talks about Minsky sailed in from Harvard. Now, that's slightly disparaging, okay? So they didn't get on. And I can sort of understand because Minsky was a fairly grumpy personality and Goodwin was apparently a very bonhomie-oriented person. Then he says he wasn't enthusiastic about Minsky's work because Goodwin wrote his doctoral thesis on the behaviour of money and found it wasn't important. So he ruled it out. Then, 2 paragraphs down, he says, my grandfather was a banker with his own private bank. In the 30s, the cash crisis meant he had to sell at a great loss most of his fortune in order to pay off all these depositors. So he personally went through a financial crisis. His family went through it. And he still didn't bring it together. So he tried to advise me not to do monetary work, and I completely ignored that advice. So ironically, Goodwin and Minsky, if they'd actually had any sense of collaboration, could have put this together 20 years before I did, but they didn't. So I took Minsky and thought Goodwin is a perfect foundation for Minsky. And this is where a lot of people look at Minsky in terms of hedge versus speculative versus Ponzi finance and things like that and transition curves. To me, I dived in at this point because this was expressed as a differential equation. And one thing I remember seeing a great presentation by a religious scholar, actually religious economic scholar, arguing that if you look at the work of people like Marx and Ricardo and Malthus and Smith, what you can find is they're talking in terms of verbal differential equations. They're saying this factor will cause this one to change. And so what he would do is often say, well, let's take these statements and put them in actual mathematical form and see whether what they said would happen is correct. 90% of the time it wasn't. But this to me was a beautiful statement of a mathematical differential equation system, the natural starting place for analysing the relation between debt and income. Now for a start, most economists, including most non-mainstreamers, still can't see a relationship between the two, but Minsky was saying this one. Take an economy with a cyclical path that is now doing well. So it's a cyclical economy on the upswing. And what you do with a set of differential equations is you've done, even with that basic model with the moose and the wolves, you take a particular starting point. Initial number of wolves, initial number of moose. The same thing for the Goodwin model. Initial level of employment, initial wages share. And then you see the dynamics from there. And he says the inherited debt structure reflects the history, which includes a period where things didn't do all that well. So he's got a previous slump. And then he says, come on, cursor, acceptable liability structures are based on some margin for error, but then because the economy is recovered, most of those projects succeed, it pays to leave her. Now that was a beautiful, very simple statement of a process of change through time, which I could express using differential equations. So that was Goodwin, and I thought, well, all I need to do is to generalise Goodwin. Now one thing neoclassicals will tell you, when you're an undergraduate student, when you object to some, I'd like to use the word F. Okay, effing ridiculous assumption, like perfect knowledge and crap like that. They'll say, don't worry, we simplify the assumption in the future. Bullshit. They make even more ridiculous assumptions because they're necessary to hold together the archaic equilibrium structure they've got. You know, you get to the stage where they assume you can all rationally anticipate future taxes, and that's what you do when you go shopping. Nonsense. But you can generalise with a system dynamics model. You start from a stylised simple thing, you make it more general. So Goodwin has the assumption that capitalists invest all their profits. To me that's obviously not correct. They invest less than their profits during a slump and more than their profits during a boom. Now I used a non-linear function to show that in the 95 paper, but all you have to do is have one which is not an identity. If investments is not identically equal to profits, you have a straight line relationship if they're not identical, and you have investment rising more than profits do as having that slope, you'll have an investment function that means that capitalists invest less than their profits during a slump, more than their profits during a boom. So they have to borrow money to pay for that. And I also had, Goodwin left out depreciation, and that's actually extremely important as it turns out in the mathematics of the model. I won't get a chance to explain that here, but I think you'll see it if you work out various equilibrium situations and growth paths and so on. the depreciation rate plays a major role. So I had gross investment being a function of the rate of profit, and gross investment being modelling as a fraction of GDP. And I added debt as a source of investment. So I had a change in debt is gross investment, not net, okay, because you pay for depreciation afterwards, minus profits. And then what I had to do was have a third social class, of course. So I had to have bankers inside there. So profit was output minus wages minus interest on outstanding debt. So the capitalists get the gap, but you get the first profits. Bankers get interest on debt. Workers earn wages. And I added a non-linear function, as I said, but just exactly the same structure as the function I showed you for the Phillips curve will work here, because it's not the non-linearities you impose on the model, it's the non-linearities that are natural to the model that matter. And that's multiplying one variable by another. As you take a look back at those equations, I'll show you some equations of that. So what I did to bring in this model, let's go back and see if I can find it. Too many bloody models open. Okay, that's the basic model there. Now what I've got, if you look at it here, is I've got investment minus wages is profits, and profits become investment. So down here you've got to replace it with a gross investment function. And what I used was this function. I said output, there's output minus wages gives you profit. And then I had gross investment, capital depreciation subtracted to give net. So you introduce it between profit and gross investment. Okay? So to give you, let's just do that. I'll do it quickly here on screen. I hope I've got the right version loaded. Let's see. Yes, I have. That's one of the advantages of the new beta. So I want to add in something like lambda s and lambda z here, but I want that to be pi underscore s for the slope of the profit to investment function, and I'll give that a value of 10. Have you got that file open? You can do this yourselves if you like at the same time. It's always worth getting the practice of doing this yourselves. So I give it a maximum of 20, say minimum of 1, and a slope of 1. So that's your profit slope parameter. Then I need a profit 0 parameter, and I'll say a profit rate of 3%, fairly low value, 0.03, say a maximum of 0.1, not minus 1, 0.1, and a minimum of say 0.02, step size of 0.01. You can vary all these during the simulation, by the way. So there's my elements for the the investment function. And if I now say I and v underscore curly brackets fn investment function, that's just a variable that I can attach my investment function to at a later stage. So I want to have profit coming in here, and rather than going to gross investment at the moment, delete that wire and have the investment function coming out of here. Well, it's profit. The rate of profit is the amount of profit you make divided by capital. Okay, so you have a divided by key there. This is one of the hassles when I put things too close together. Minsky gets confused as to how to select. So that's now going to be a profit rate. Grab the corner box down here to expand the size measure. So pi underscore r for rate. And then wire that up. There's my profit rate. Now I'm going to feed this into a profit function, so I want to have that minus the profit share. That's getting pretty messy over there. I'll just make the thing full screen, but I can turn it around a moment. So profit rate, not the profit rate minus the profit 0. That's the gap. Multiplied by the profit slope, and I'll just flip these things around. If you choose the flip command, and I'll flip that as well. Just means you can go back in the opposite direction, not go right off the screen. Flip investment around. that's the investment function. Then you multiply that, that's a proportion of output that's going to be used for investment. Multiply the two together. Now, I've had people say that I don't have a demand-driven model. Sorry, investment is part of demand. I don't have a consumption-driven model, but I do have an investment-driven model. Consumption is a residual. So part of the way of generalising this model would be bring in consumption as an actual causal factor, and then your residual is going to be stocks. But that gets much more complicated, putting it mildly. So that's your investment function times your output level is gross investment. And now when I do that, let's just simulate and see what happens. Notice nothing apparently happens. Okay? Because I've now got capitalists investing more than they borrow during a boom and less during a slump. We can actually take a look at that and graph it. Let's just move these things around a bit. Again, the main advantage of the new beta is being able to multiple select and then move a set of objects together. It just makes life easier to be able to do that. So that's gross investment. We'll just grab this lot and move them over a bit as well. You can change the shape of wires. You do a lot of fiddling with GUI-based programs. Isn't necessarily productive, but that's one reason I'm going to be adding the capability in the next version of Minsky to be able to write the equations directly. I can't get that little blue dot. Okay, there's some parts of the interface which, again, we've got to just make it more user-friendly, just not grabbing it. I'll have to show that to Russell. So I want to graph the investment function and show investment as a fraction of GDP. So let's grab the investment function over here, flip it around, and then how does that rise and fall over time? Well, you can look at it now and see what it's going to. It's too extreme. Got huge booms and huge lumps in investment. Negative investment as well. That's something I'd use a nonlinear function to avoid. Okay? Or you can use a cutoff point. But that's just giving you an idea of how it's made the model more elaborate. But there is no structural change to the model. Okay? Because it still has the same basic dynamics. So the next stage, and I think I'll just check the presentation, see where I bring it in. I haven't yet brought debt inside there. So what I need to have, when investment exceeds depreciation, exceeds profit, you're going to have debt. So if I now have a look at gross, find where's gross investment here. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, there's gross investment. Copy of that. This is fairly ugly. I'd be doing it more carefully if I was doing an actual presentation version. But investment minus profits, flip that around, is the rate of change of debt. So I now need another integrator. The ampersand gives me that straight away. Make that capital D for debt. And I could give initial values for it, but I'll just put the initial value in the box there instead and have that starting at 0. And now, when you've got debt, you have to have interest on debt. So let's just drag this down a bit. And I need a new variable called R. I'll make it R underscore L for rate of interest on loans. Another parameter. And let's just say that's got a value of 0.04, maximum of 0.2, minimum of 0.01, let's say. Step size of 1, 0.1. Okay. Now, you therefore have to multiply interest on outstanding debt by outstanding debt and subtract that from output, which is up here, and you've now got profit as output minus wages minus interest on debt. Okay, you've now got a debt ratio as one of your functions, although now I can actually define a debt ratio, so D underscore R, and just wire that up there, You can take multiple wires out of one point. Okay, there's quite a bit of flexibility in the program. Let's take a copy of that, whack a graph in, and then let's simulate and see what happens. And you have what I discovered when I wrote the first model. A dramatic change in the nature of the model. I would still remember when I first saw this, because I did it in the third bedroom in my then marital home in Marrickville in Sydney. And I remember thinking at the time that chaos theory and complexity was just getting used by neoclassical economists to put wiggly bits on their graphs. And then I generated the first graph in Mathematica, nowhere near as visual as Minsky is, and I went, holy hell, that looks like chaos to me. And I dived in further and further, and I said, I better learn about complexity theory. But notice, I mean, the values here are a bit crazy in terms of the values, because using a linear model, you will get things like negative investment coming out of it. So the reason you use a non-linear model is not because you need non-linearity in an assumption to force this sort of behaviour. Its non-linearity makes it more realistic. Capitalists do not go around smashing up factories when the rate of profit goes negative. Okay? So you simply have a tapering to zero. And my favourite nonlinear function to use is a generalised exponential function, because a generalised exponential will give you an upward slope where that's what you want, a decaying slope when you want it, with no turning points determined by the equation itself. So as much as possible I try to avoid using functions that impose their own nature on the model, because then what you're getting is it's the equation itself that's giving you the behaviour rather than the system. Okay? The one time I would use, if I do use anything which is tapered, I use what's called a sigmoidal function. Have you seen a sigmoid? It's basically a long flat S, minimum level and maximum level. And that makes sense, for example, if you're talking about the rate of technological change. You say there's some minimum rate below which it doesn't fall, and some maximum rate, no matter how much money you throw at the scientist, you can't get an increase in productivity more than, say, 5% per annum or something like that. Including the population is not going to grow at a huge rate, so an S-curve makes sense for that. But generally speaking, I prefer to use a generalised exponential so that the model is not causing the outcome that I'm seeing. But if you take a look at what's happening here once I've done that, you can see a whole range of things that were quite striking in the original model. I've mucked around putting this together. I haven't put a lot of thought into the values I've given here. But you can see the wages share is declining, rising in a cyclical way as well. I'll load one of the other models, calling this one live, so you see the way that it's created. So I'll call this Minsky live. But let's load one of the more nuanced Minsky models that I've developed for this lecture. Okay. Let's try this one. That's an old one. Pretty dreadful. Let's just see. There should be a newer one than that in that subdirectory. Okay. Right. Now this is one where that hassle with the current version, that some of the diagrams go blank and you don't know which one it is. You've just got to zoom until the things all appear to work. That's a mess. I'll go back and go to smaller scale. Come on, you bastard.
There was one further in, I think.
Yeah, that ain't going to work. What's the other ones I want? Actually, I want to see GDP versus actual. And I want these two to turn up and be visible. So you simulate the model. Actually, I want employment as well. That's so I can get lucky. No. Okay. I'll just see if I can make this one a different size and see if that makes it. This is a Windows-specific bug, by the way. We know the bug exists. We just have to get. There we go. All these things are tricky. This is the sort of stuff Russell needs to see as a programmer to realise what. There we are. Okay, good. And so I can get the growth rate as well. I just drag it right over here. Ugly, but that'll work. You bastard. And I'll put a new one in. If in doubt, cheat. Now let's see, I don't want to. So the growth rate and the equilibrium growth rate. Okay, so that's the equilibrium growth rate. That's the actual growth rate. Now let's simulate this model. And you can see a lot of very interesting things happening. Again, this is all this linear behavioural functions inside there. It's more realistic with non-linear behavioural functions. So you see the employment rate appears to be stabilising. The cycles in employment are getting smaller. I can prove, which I do in other work, which you probably find on my website, that the wages share is a proxy for the inflation rate. So what you see here is inflation falling and unemployment falling as well and getting less cyclical. A great moderation. Okay. Notice there's a rising level of private debt, which is fluctuating a lot to begin with, then it seems to go stable. Notice that the equilibrium growth rate is above the actual growth rate as well. So finance is having a negative effect on the economy, even though it's financing more investment. Then the cycles start to get more extreme, which you can call the Great Recession. It's a prelude to a crisis. If I had non-linear functions inside there, there'd be more of a downside than there was an upside. So you'd see it turning up as a downward crisis rather than here it's booms and slumps of equal size. That's just a byproduct of having linear behavioural functions there. But this is the best way to see it, because I'm not imposing any of my own assumptions about the nature of investment and so on. I'm simply saying capitalists borrow money to invest during a boom and pay off debt during a slump. And even Fama and French found that empirically when they examined the American data. So it's just a realistic simplifying assumption. And what you see is you go through a period of apparent stability and ultimately a crisis. And in terms of income shares, there's a rising amount going to bankers, a falling amount going to workers. I'll make that larger so you can see it more clearly. Now look what the capitalist share is doing. It's cyclical, but it's pretty much flatlining. So the interesting thing is, even though I've got the firms doing the borrowing of money in this model, it's the workers who are paying for it through a declining wages share of GDP. The capitalists are ending up in the middle. And again, this is something which Marx didn't have debt in his model, but he effectively anticipated it, saying the governing factor is the rate of accumulation, driven by the rate of profit. So when you restore the rate of profit to what it was at a previous level where capitalists were willing to invest exactly all that they earned, it doesn't matter to them that there's more money going to bankers and less going to workers. That's the point at which they react. But because you have this cyclical process of borrowing money, having a boom, paying off some of the decline in debt, then a change in the income shares, meaning that the rate of profit that led to investment exceeding retained earnings is restored, you get a ratcheting up of debt. And that's exactly what Minsky spoke about. So this very simple model, built on Goodwin's foundations, reveals the gist of what Minsky saw in the financial instability hypothesis, with a couple of features Minsky didn't foresee. So Minsky did not see declining inflation, but that turns up in a more general model of mine. He didn't see rising inequality, meaning that workers would be paying for it. You might have thought the financial sector gained at the expense of the industrial sector. The model shows that the bankers gain at the expense of the workers. If you look at the empirical data, that's what's happened. So this is the beauty, the insights you get out of a complex systems model can be extremely deep, and it's worth working at the simple level before you move to a more advanced model. And if you think about it, that's what I think is actually going on. I see this model as being comparable in many ways to Lorenz's model, because, as I mentioned, Lorenz's model is derived from a known dynamic of fluid under temperature and pressure, the Navier-Stokes equations. But he brought it down to an incredibly simple model that had this inherent instability. When you do this Minsky model, incredibly simple, but an inherent instability. And the tendencies we see in the real economy turn up in this simple model. In fact, they turned up in the simple model before they turned up in the real economy, which is still one of the most striking experiences of my life. That, I finished off an article what I thought was a rhetorical flourish, and then the rhetorical flourish happened. Period of diminishing cycles before a boom. So that's the basic idea. That's, again, I'm showing you can see I've just taken that extract in the full model I was showing you a moment ago. And there are emergent properties in this. Again, a lot of people who are learning complex systems now, and possibly happening at the room next door, complex systems they immediately associate with interactions of heterogeneous agents, like a bottom-up syndrome. It occurs top-down as well, and the same thing applies again with the Lorenz model, because this is a tops-down model. This is a model describing the X and Y location of fluid on a hot plate and the temperature gradient. It's not saying these are molecules of H2O bouncing off each other. Okay? So you can get an emergent property in a system which is built from the top down. And in fact, it's a lot easier. I know I have students who've spent 3 years trying to build a multi-agent model that simulates what I get out of this model. Okay? And they had to leave out various elements of the real world because the computing overheads in multi-agent model are huge. I might show you some of those models and give you an idea of just how large they can be. It's a worthwhile endeavour, but I think it's much better to work with the system dynamics level and make it more realistic. So you see, turning up on the model, what we see in the empirical data, a cyclically rising level of debt to GDP. It's more stylised than the real data, but that's what we see in the data itself. Rising inequality, so more money going to bankers, less going to workers. And diminishing cycles and then a crisis, which the Neoclassicals of thought was their good work. So when you look back and say, given Minsky, how much of this could you have predicted? Definitely the rising level of private debt, part of Minsky's hypothesis. And what he did was really explain what Fisher had used as an endpoint, too much debt in a situation of too low inflation, causing a Great Depression. Minsky explained how you get there by a series of cycles, so that was definitely his vision. But you can imply rising inequality as well, but there's no way in Minsky's hypothesis you could say that bankers would be gaining at the expense of workers. It's something which only the model can tell you. And then having a great moderation before the crisis. So I wrote this little conclusion when I finished it. This vision of a capitalist economy with finance requires us to go beyond excessive reliance upon the stable past as a guide to the future. The chaotic dynamics should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility in a capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. I didn't expect that to happen. Okay. But it did. And then, of course, the bloody Neoclassicals come along. And it's not, when I look back on the data, it's not the first time it's happened. It's hard to find it in the Great Depression data because the data is fundamentally annual. And the debt's recorded at the end of the year. Unemployment rate is recorded like in the midpoint of the year, so there's lots of timing issues. But if you take a look at it, a similar phenomenon happened in the 1920s. You had huge cycles in inflation. A large part of that was driven by return to the gold standard. It affected America as well, so massive inflation to massive deflation. But cycles in inflation heading towards deflation. Deflation was actually happening in the late 1920s. So before the Great Depression began, there was a period of negative price inflation. Unemployment cycles diminishing. And then bang, out of the blue. Now look at the data. It's much clearer in the 1980 to 2010 data now. There are reviews of the diminishing cycles in inflation and unemployment. Neoclassicals take the credit for this, particularly Bernanke, and then bang, this happens. This was their good management, that's an exogenous shock. I'm sorry guys, it's all sort of one bloody process you can't see because of your obsession with equilibrium. Now when you take a look at private debt, a similar phenomenon, more extreme during the Great Depression. So if you look just at the debt ratio, what you see is debt rising compared to GDP right out to the middle of 1932. But if you look at the rate of change of debt, you see it was actually negative from the 1930s on, and substantially negative, because firms were paying off their debt, reducing their debt by 5% of GDP, but GDP was falling by 20%. So the ratio rose, even though the level of debt, outstanding debt, actually fell, because it's not quite as extreme in our data. But what you can see from not only from 1980, right from 1945 forward, there was no period where the change in private debt was negative until the crisis. And then you had it going from plus 15% of GDP, which is over here, down to minus 5%, which is here. And the turn from positive credit to negative credit is what caused the Great Recession. And I love this. This is why I hate not being able to have a negative citation for somebody. Me citing Bernanke, praising himself for the Great Moderation, saying, as evidence for improved control of inflation has contributed to this welcome change in the economy. What they saw as a welcome change, I saw as a warning sign, which is why I started writing Debunking Economics back in 2000, because my model was telling me that this is a prelude to a serious crisis. So the only way you're going to change the nature of economics is if enough people see that the crisis comes when the economists are confident there's going to be no crisis. That's why I started sticking my neck out and making all those warnings at that stage. Now, when you look at how they tried to explain the Great Recession after it happened, here's a guy called Ireland, based in Boston. The pattern of exogenous demand and supply disturbances, there were exogenous shocks, that caused the Great Recession was very similar to the previous two downturns. The other trouble is that a series of adverse shocks got bigger and lasted longer. Well, duh. What were the shocks, Mr. Ireland? Okay? If they were that big, you should be able to specify them. Okay? It's all this stuff that Roma talked about, all this magical stuff causing the changes. So now, if I showed you earlier, you could derive Goodwin's model from definitions. When you look at the equation for debt particularly in the 1995 paper, it's quite a complicated expression, certainly compared to the other two. But it took me a while to realise it can also be derived by the definition of the debt ratio. The debt ratio is defined as the level of debt divided by GDP. So you can then have the rate of change of that, percentage rate of change of the debt ratio, is percentage rate of change of debt minus percentage rate of change of GDP. And verbally, the debt ratio will grow if debt grows faster than GDP. Well, duh. It's true, it's obvious. So if you link it to the other system states, I now have debt financing gross investment, interest payments being subtracted from profit, and what you get, I'm waiting for this to turn up, those are the two definitions beforehand. That's all I've added, that definition. And the Goodwin equations that you've already done in the other model were here. So to work out the debt equation, I've got to go through this process, first of all, defining what the rate of change of GDP is. We've already done that elsewhere, but it's the investment function now. It's no longer 1 minus omega, which was when you presumed capitalists invest all their profits and profits were net of wages. You now have the investment function up there divided by V, which is the same minus delta K. So that's the revised definition of Y. And derive D, all I've got to do is say what is the rate of change of the debt ratio. Well, that's 1 over D multiplied by gross investment minus profits. And you've got to do a bit of reworking. And often the mathematician who taught me mathematics in first year at university was quite a brilliant teacher and a brilliant thinker. And he said there are basically 3 rules to mathematics. What have you got that you don't want? Get rid of it. What haven't you got that you need? Put it in. Keep it balanced. So I've got 1 over D dividing, I've got D dividing IG minus pi, but I actually want Y there. So I simply bring it in, Y over Y. I haven't changed anything. Then I can shuffle the terms around and say Y over D. And this 1 minus IG over minus pi over Y, which I know that's the investment function and that's the profit share. So it's a simple little manoeuvre. And Y over D is the inverse of D. So by bringing that in, I've now got a simple little expression. That's the gross investment function. That's the profit share, which I use pi little s for. So B little s for banker's share, pi little s for profit share, and then I've got omega for workers' share. So there's my equation. So if you try the one that you have already done, if you're successful in writing that up earlier, the proportional definition of Minsky, so is that the one I'm looking for? Nope, that's the... We need a better way of being able to indicate which models are open. Okay, let's get rid of this one. That's no more need for Lorenz. Don't need that one. Don't need that Lorenz. That's just an expanded graph. That's the flowchart version. What I want to do is bring up the... actually, I'll save that given the hassle in graphing. So that's the model I'm looking for. So there's your model with wages share and employment. Have a crack at putting the debt equation inside there. I'll go back and put it up for you to take a look at. And bring that down. Let's see what I've got here. So you need a pi capital lowercase capital S, which is the slope of the investment function, a pi lowercase capital Z, which is the 0, which I give a value of 3% to, a pi lowercase s, which is the definition of profit share, and that is actually basically profit divided by output. Okay, and then you've done that with an extra variable for debt, which is an extra integral equation. You can define the model properly. So I'll just cheat a bit here and drag stuff around to get space. Let's see. Nah. This is why I work with a giant monitor back at home. So I want an integral equation for D. Have a crack at doing it yourselves, of course. And I need, let's see, I underscore S. Underscore Z. That's all I need, I think, just those three entities on profit share. Okay. And I'll just go large for a moment. So profit share. Actually, it's one. I've got to define it in terms of the system of states I have, and that is 1 minus omega minus R times D. So I need a rate of interest as well. So there's profit share defined. And then the D equation, let's just bring it up on screen again. Notice one trap there, it's divided by D rather than multiplied, which is different to the other equation where it had D multiplied by. So and I have the investment function. I haven't defined the profit rate, but the profit rate is actually the profit share divided by V. Should be able to work that out logically. I'll just grab hold of V. Okay, so now I have, let's see, profit function, which is
What is R again?
rate of interest.
Oh yeah.
Okay. There's profit rate minus profit Z multiplied by, that's pi slope there, multiplied by the profit slope. Minus profit share. That's the first part of the equation.
Yeah.
And there's also a minus there, so I've got to just fix that up. That's the same expression here, so to just help if that's my investment function there. So let's call that investment function. Copy that. This is messy as hell, but just doing the thing quickly. Minus depreciation, so I've got to find depreciation. Now check what the definition of D looks like. Okay, so it's 1 over D profit share, yada yada, minus yeah, that's correct, minus investment, that's correct. Okay, so now we can whack in an extra graph there for the debt ratio. This is all very messy. Invalid divide by, because I've got a debt equal to 0. So you need an initial condition, hang on, that's just above 0. So I get it 0.01. And I've done something totally wrong. So I've got negative debt turning up there. Okay. But, let's see, equations. What have I done wrong? Okay, I'm going to have to give up on that and take a look at it later. One of the dangers of doing models live. What I was trying to get to was this model, which is done properly and laid out properly, as you can see. And you get a very nice display of all the characters I was talking about beforehand. Wages share declining, there's a direct linear relationship between the wages share and debt share in this model. Rising debt means falling wages share. Increasing debt ratio. Debt ratio versus profit share pretty much going sideways. And then finally a crisis. Now, Neoclassicals are still trying to explain the Great Recession. They're actually trying to forget it rather than explain it. You know, it'll be an outlier for them in the future. It's part of the system, and it's been part of the system since the history of capitalism. That's the overall set of equations. Again, you've got a copy of that model in the slides I've sent to you. And what you can see is what Minsky anticipated, which is private debt leading to a crisis and a series of booms and busts, but also the tranquility before the crisis that Minsky did not anticipate. Minsky did say stability is destabilising. Okay, that's why it's on my T-shirt. But what he was thinking about is in an individual cycle. He wasn't imagining over a whole series of cycles that the scale of the cycles would diminish before the crisis occurred. And because also the rising inequality, which we didn't see. So there's a whole lot of stuff to analyse, and the diminishing then rising volatility was a very surprising event to me. And I went looking to see, is there any mathematical precursor to this? And in fact, it's something that comes out of the Lorenz equations that I showed you a while ago. One of the many transitions to chaos that can occur in the Lorenz equations is a period of diminishing volatility in a fluid flow. In what they talk about is going from turbulent to laminar flow, and then when it looks like it's nice and smooth, the laminar becomes turbulent again. So it's a Fermat-Manivelle route to chaos. And logically, and I explain this in Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis, what is actually going on is you've got a 3-class income distribution system, not just 2. In Marx's system, if profit went down, wages went up and vice versa. But in this, profit and wages can both go down while banker's share goes up. So it gives you a more complex relationship in the overall dynamics. But Marx was fundamentally right when he said the rate of accumulation is the independent variable. That's what's driving the whole system. But it's driving capitalists to borrow more over time than they can repay, and the rising inequality ultimately leads to a crisis, which we've seen in the real world. And what I haven't also done in this presentation, but I did do in the 95 paper, I rarely refer back to it because I mainly work in like a private sector model fundamentally, was counter-cyclical government. And that gives you a much more complicated 3-dimensional model. You can only model that using nonlinear behavioural functions, because when you have so many interacting linear equations, you just get bigger and bigger madness. But if I bring up that particular model, so I can actually find a version of it, I'll show that. I love how Windows sometimes doesn't do anything in response to a search command. Let's go back and I'll try, I'll just close it and start it again. Oh, come on. Yeah, here we go, finally. Okay. I'm hoping that's... No, that's actually a sector showing government in sort of a modern monetary theory framework. So this is the model. It's a long time since I've run this model. But this is the model including a government sector. So bang, that's failing. Okay. Let's try private and government, let's say. Nope, that's also... I produce far too many models, as you can see. Minsky government sector with controls. Let's see if that one works. Okay, I'm stuck. There can be various variations we've made in various formats of Minsky, meaning I can't load that modelling. But if you have a crack at it, you can actually put that model to Minsky without too much difficulty. He says, let's see, Minsky flowchart for government. Let's give that one a try. Okay. And this includes price dynamics as well, by the way. And what you get is the economy effectively being stabilised by government spending. But if I set up the parameters differently, the government can't spend fast enough to make up for a private sector crash. Oh, here we go, it's happening. There's a private sector crash. So the government's not spending fast enough to make up for the decline in employment. The economy is collapsing. Okay. So, and you're seeing banker share go through the roof and so on. There's a nonlinear Phillips curve, nonlinear investment function, and all of those are defined down here. What I'm using here as well, which I haven't explained to you guys, again of a good lack of time, is a logical switch. Is that element down the bottom there? Mm-hmm. That's this thing. And what that lets you have a logical statement in the top and one of two conditions that are executed, depending on the value of the function. So I can have something, for example, which stops the inflation adjustment for interest rates going negative if inflation goes negative, that sort of thing. I can also have a nonlinear versus a linear function. So that's with nonlinear functions here. If I press notice the little dot there, which is currently showing at the top on 1. If I press the up arrow, he says, if I press the up arrow, maybe the down arrow, there we go. That says go from nonlinear to linear functions. And you get a very different dynamic coming out of it. Notice the Phillips curve and the investment function are both linear now. Mm-hmm. So there's a range of control commands that, we have to get a full set of documentation done for Minsky by the end of a year's time. So that'll explain all the various functions there. But that's a very useful function to have a logical function. All the other programs have it. What's different about ours is ours actually shows you which one is being executed. And notice the little black bar up there is going up to the top one. At the current level of the system, that's showing that that's using a linear investment function. If I press the up arrow, that goes down to the bottom, showing the non-linear is executed. So we're trying to make the program as visual as possible. So, now how are we doing on time? What time are we finishing today? 4:30? Okay. 4. Okay, not long to go. Well, let's just get rolling. So what I want to now do, and that's all showing you the system dynamics side of Minsky, but the main reason I designed Minsky was for the monetary modelling, which no other program can do. And I tried to do models of finance in things like VisSim and so on, and always I'd fail to get the logic right because you've got to connect all these elements of a flowchart together. And always make a mistake. I'd be decrementing one account but not incrementing another. Or I'd decrement one account and increment the wrong account. The wires gave you no control over what you were doing. And I realised after working with Godley for a while that the tabular view was the way to do it. So I first of all started doing single entry bookkeeping, and then I realised the importance of double entry bookkeeping. So Minsky only supports double entry bookkeeping now. And that means with double entry bookkeeping, you can look at a table and work out what the flows are. You know you've decremented the right account. You know whether you have or haven't done the increase and decrease of different accounts. So that, to me, was essential. But, of course, the Neoclassicals argue it's not necessary. So here's their logic. This is Bernanke his book called Essays on the Great Depression. Do not buy it. Okay, get it out from the library. Don't pay the guy any money. He's got enough. But you can imagine the guy who's seen as the expert on the Great Depression would have read all the explanations, considered them seriously. Certainly somebody like Fisher. You'd have to have a serious look at Fisher's arguments. Well, he starts off not too wrong by saying a dynamic process with falling asset and commodity prices putting pressure on nominal debtors, yada, yada, yada. That's not too bad. But he then says it was less influential in academic circles because of the counter-argument. And have a look at this. I mean, I can't believe how intelligent people make themselves brain dead by swallowing this theory. Debt deflation represented no more than a redistribution from one group, debtors, to another group, creditors. Now, for a start, when people go bankrupt, they don't pay their creditors back. Not even considering that in the statement. And then he says, absent implausibly large differences in marginal spending propensities, pure redistributions should have no significant macroeconomic effects. So they're seeing lending as a redistribution, not a creation of money. So this is the essential role of loanable funds in putting blinkers over their eyes. Plus, they also don't even look at things like, people going bankrupt, meaning they don't pay their creditors back. And now when they're bringing it in, it's all about frictions. The financial sector is a source of frictions, slowing down the return to equilibrium, not a banana skin that slips you into a crisis in the first place, which is much closer to what it is. This is probably my favourite piece of garbage, Gerbash garbage. Fair Garbage 2017. I read the abstract of this paper and I just thought these guys are, even amongst neoclassicals, they're off with the fairies. We establish a benchmark result for the relationship between loanable funds and the money creation approach to banking, which they're now forced to consider because rather than just being rebels like myself saying banks create money, it's now the Bank of England, the Bundesbank, so on and so forth. They're forced to consider it. We show that both processes yield the same allocations, and look at this, when there is no uncertainty and thus no bank default. This is 1 decade after, if there hadn't been government rescues, all but one bank in America would have failed. Okay, and there were bank failures. It says, in such cases, using the much simpler loanable funds approach does not imply any loss of generality. Flying pigs. Okay. So, you've got to look at their basis for dismissing it is loanable funds. And here's Krugman, who's probably the main defender of that piece of ideology. Not quite as insane as fair garbage, but nonetheless fair garbage anyway. Hi, Cole. He's saying the level of debt matters only if the distribution of net worth matters, only if highly indebted players face different constraints. And therefore that's why he says government borrowing. In that sense, he defends the need for government borrowing, which is a positive of his position, but it's a positive maintaining a false paradigm. And that's why I'm quite happy to attack him. Because think of it this way. When debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. There's no money creation going on. It's less patient people borrowing from more patient people. Now, again, the language these guys use, they talk about having a normative science. And they use pejorative terms. Who's the good person, the patient person or the impatient person? Okay? Why not say more innovative, borrowing from less innovative? Okay? There's pejorative terms turning up everywhere. Now along comes the Bank of England, versus their cotton socks. And actually, I knew these authors before the paper came out. I was actually visiting the Bank of England on occasions before I moved to the UK. And I knew quite a few of these people. I think there's hats off to you for writing this paper because you've made our lives much better. You let a lot of realism into economics. So I really appreciate this work. So money creation, banks are not intermediaries, they don't lend out deposits, and they don't multiply up central bank money. So finally, an authority figure like the Bank of England is saying it rather than minority personalities like myself and Wynne Godley and Hyman Minsky and Basil Moore and Richard Werner, all of whom they've continued ignoring. So, thank God for the bank for doing it. But they're still dismissive, they're still hostile. It's just less dismissive and less hostile. So here's Krugman talking about it. They're saying, it's a good paper, yeah, but it doesn't really change anything. Let's not let monetary realism slide into money mysticism. Now, my position is these guys are doing barter mysticism. Okay? They're mystically imagining a world in which there's no money and calling it capitalism. They're the mystics, not people talking about money. So the reason for designing Minsky was the Godley Tables. And we've got 10 minutes, so I'll quickly start this and we'll finish off tomorrow. So what Godley Tables do is divide all financial flows, stocks, into assets, liabilities or equity. And it makes sure that everything is balanced in your equations, including your initial conditions. Okay? So you show all financial entries twice, once as a source and once as a destination. And if you build an elaborate model where you have different banks, then you have 4 entries: source and sink, recipient bank and sender bank. And you impose what's called the fundamental rule of accounting, and that is that assets minus liabilities minus equity equals 0. And Minsky makes sure that happens by summing each row, to make sure that applies to each row. So if you lay out a basic monetary system, I have a bank lending funds to a firm sector, the firm sector hiring workers who then in the background are producing output in physical factories, which I don't include in these simple models. And then firms and workers and bankers all buy the output of the factories. And the columns I start with, and try this yourselves, you could bring up a blank Minsky model. Use the beta. Click on the bank icon. Place it on the canvas. Click once again. Right click. Title it. Call it banking sector view. So you can actually say that this is the banking sector's view, because you can have multiple views, multiple Godley tables, which is an important part of the software and something we're extending over time. Open the Godley table. Press on the plus key so you can see the columns more clearly. And the columns I had there, I'll just make my... Okay, there you go. So I want reserves, so you simply type reserves up here. Press another plus key to get an extra asset column. Loans, underscore curly brackets, firms, close curly brackets. Go to the liabilities, and you have DE, POS. I'm using much longer words than I need to, but it's just to make the logic clearer in the model. Click to get another liability column, deposits, underscore workers, close curly brackets, and then I'll just have to make the window a bit broader here. So equity, underscore curly brackets, banks, close curly brackets. And there you've got a basic definition of the accounts in a simple model of the economy. And given a value, say 1,000 in reserves and 1,000 in equity, and Minsky makes sure the sum is 0. Okay. All right? Now, banks lend to firms, firms hire workers, firms pay interest to banks, workers consume, bankers consume and invest, and firms repay the debt. So that's what it looks like. So let's do that. And again, this is just placeholders at the moment. So I type lend to firms, that's just a label. You can write anything there, but we're going to improve that over time, make it more of a control system. So there's lending to firms, which increases assets, and lending to firms, of course, increases the deposit accounts at the bank, and Minsky makes sure the sum is 0. If you make a mistake, there'll be a non-zero sum there. Hire workers, that's minus wages out of the deposit account of firms, and plus wages going into workers' accounts. Pay interest, so that's minus INT coming out of the firm's account, and plus INT going into the equity of banks. So can workers consume, so I have minus CONS underscore W coming out of the deposit accounts, and plus CONS underscore W going into the firm's accounts. Bankers buy, they're doing more than consuming, obviously. a lot of consuming, but nonetheless. So minus buy underscore B for the bankers, and buy underscore B going into the firm's accounts, and then they repay debt. So to repay debt, you've got to take money out of your deposit accounts. That's minus repay underscore F, and that means the bank also reduces the outstanding debt by precisely the same amount. So that's pretty fast, and this is one thing where Minsky is much faster than doing this stuff by hand. He's now created a bank icon where you can see all those elements, the flows on the left side. Hang on. The flows on the left side and the stocks coming out the bottom. And if you look at the differential equations you've defined that set of differential equations. And trust me, you couldn't write them that fast in paper, let alone on another computer program. And they're all guaranteed stock flow consistent, okay? Because that's what the Godley table is doing for you. Okay? So I'm going to save that as Godley Live. I wish he was. He was a lovely human being and a brilliant thinker. So that one's done. And if you want to play around tonight, play around with that. See if you can you've got the slides now. You see what I do further on with that model. Play with it yourself if you like. I'll just quickly show you before we break for lunch or whatever else. Break for coffee. Once you've got the model defined in terms of one Godley table, you can bring up another. If you right click, and let's say I'll make this the firm sectors view. Open up the Godley table, and notice these down arrows here. I'll just make the window a bit larger. The down arrows, if you click in an asset down arrow, it says go look for a liability that hasn't been allocated as an asset to anybody else. So you click on it, you'll find well, deposits of firms are a liability of the banking sector, and deposits of workers are a liability of the banking sector. They're therefore an asset of somebody else. I want to look at the asset of the firms, click on deposits, all the operations are brought across in one go. Then I click on liability, or loans to firms are a liability, they're brought across and they match the area there. If they're in the wrong position, you just click and hold, and you can drag it somewhere else, okay, to move objects around. Now all you've got to do is complete the equation. So I'm going to call this firms underscore curly brackets equity, and then of course payments by the banking sector to buy goods off the firm sector add to the firm's equity, so does consumption by workers, interest payments reduce it, and wages reduce it. So that's now balanced, and you've now got a two-sectoral view of the economy. And if you want to have a look at the workers, then they tend to be the passive ones in any of these models. They're the ones that get done over rather than do. Open up, and then what's the asset that hasn't been allocated? Deposits by workers. They don't have any liabilities in this model. You can add them in later, of course. So workers underscore equity. And then all you need to do is to add the consumption reduces their equity and wages increase their equity. And you've got a balanced model across three sectors. Now, what I haven't done with you guys, particularly haven't done your presentation on modern monetary theory, I want to bring in the central bank. Right, you can actually right-click inside. You can right-click inside. He says, right, okay, title, central bank, and we have a liability. We have an asset that hasn't been allocated as a liability yet, which is reserves. Okay, so there are reserves of the banking sector now shown as a liability of the central bank. Now, why is reserves showing up as zero though? It should be more than zero.
2,000.
Pardon?
1,000.
1,000 there should be, yeah. But it turned up as zero there. Hang on. That has me puzzled. Oh no, the rate of flow through reserves. That's still, I haven't done any operations on it yet. Okay, so I now have to have an asset to balance it, and I'll call this CB or loans underscore CB upper score banks, for example, and having now offer create reserves. Now notice there's a problem there. That's something. Loan CB banks have gone to the wrong side. This occasionally happens. It's a bug. I'm not sure what to do about that, because reserves should have turned up as an asset. Okay, that's a bug. Great. So we've spotted this one beforehand. It's a pain that it's turned up now. So what I might do is delete that godly icon and hope it works. It doesn't happen with the second instance. So open it up. There's an initialization of a variable causes this trouble. No, I've lost reserves. Actually, I've lost reserves completely. They've been deleted from that other icon. Yeah. Wow.
Okay, the same thing happened.
Yeah.
I thought I was doing it wrong.
Oh, well, that's actually, I'm going to show that bug to Russell. That's a serious bug. That's an initialization. We've already spotted it about 3 or 4 days ago, but he hasn't had a chance to work on it yet. So I'll save that and come back to it. So there are bugs, as I've said. The whole reason for the beta program, the whole reason for the Patreon page, and thank God I've got the funding from Friends Provident, is to improve the interface, get rid of bugs, add more power. That's going to be happening over time. Okay, see you all tomorrow, or dinner tonight.